Time-lapse photography is a great way to capture motion and movement and add a story to a scene. Sometimes when you take photos, you find that you just don't capture the whole scene in its entirety, usually because there's some motion or movement happening that's not being captured in a still image. Often when I capture traffic, cars driving the road, or a sunset that might take place over an hour, throughout that scene it constantly changes and I'm unable to capture the whole story in one image. And that's why time-lapse is so great. It allows you to take minutes or possibly even hours of footage and condense it down into just a few seconds of video. When you capture a time-lapse, you take multiple images and then you push them together to create a video. And for every 1 second of final footage, you need 30 images. So we're going to shoot a 10-second time-lapse here, and for that we need to take 300 images. It might seem a lot, but it all depends on your interval. So I'm shooting some traffic here. It's fairly fast moving, and as a result, I only need a 1 second interval between each clip. If I was shooting the Milky Way, that might be a 30-second interval. If I'm shooting something that's moving very, very slowly, like some barges moving along the river, then perhaps that would be a 5 or a 3-second interval. Something that moves fast, like traffic here, a 1 second interval is going to work great. So the technical camera settings. First of all, you obviously need a tripod, put your camera on a tripod, and you want to shoot in manual mode. The aperture is the most important factor of a time-lapse, and that's because you want to keep it all the way open. You see, when you don't have the aperture all the way open, every time you go to take a photo, your aperture goes from fully open to stop down, fully open to stop down. And the thing is, every time it does that, it adjusts ever so slightly. It's not perfect. It's not going to be exactly the same every time. And these differences in exposure cause what's called flicker. So when you set your aperture all the way open, you can prevent that camera flicker, which is going to be a much better option for you when it comes to time-lapse photography. So I'm going to leave my aperture all the way open at f2.8 here, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit to capture this traffic. And I'm going to see what my camera is going to suggest is going to be 1/640th of a second at ISO 100. That's faster than I'd like it to be because every image is going to be perfectly sharp and I'd rather just a little bit of motion blur, but the aperture is more important than the shutter speed. So the camera setup's ready to go now. All you need is an intervalometer. Your camera probably, well maybe not probably, but quite often has this built into your camera. However, I still recommend getting an external intervalometer because this makes it much easier to make the adjustments to capture a time lapse.
The intervalometer works in 5 different ways. There's delay. This is how long you want it to wait before you take a photo. So you might use that if you're taking a big group family photo. Give yourself 15 seconds to run into the frame. There's long. This is for a long exposure. Perhaps you want a 1-minute exposure because your camera only goes to 30. You can set that here. Interval, this is what we use for time-lapse. We don't use those first two for time-lapse at all. This is where we set what the interval is going to be. It can be hours, minutes, and seconds. This was 1 second, 2 seconds. N, this is N for number of photos you want to take in your sequence. We set it to 300 here. And the last one is sound, whether you want sound or not. I do not want sound, so I leave that off. And then all I need to do is hit start. It's plugged into my camera. I'm on single shot shooting mode. I've manually focused, so I know exactly what's going to be in focus. And all I have to do is hit start. My camera is going to take it from there.
And because I'm taking 300 images and they're 1 second apart each, this whole time lapse is going to take exactly 5 minutes to complete. Very simple and very easy to do. Once we've captured all of these images, we're going to go over to Lightroom and another piece of software called LR Time-Lapse, and we're going to create a time-lapse from scratch using that software. Don't worry, it's a little bit complicated, but I'm going to walk you through the entire process. So let's go ahead and start this time-lapse. Now that we've captured the time-lapse, let's go back to the office and edit it all together. Once you've imported your photographs into Lightroom, what I'd like you to do is to right-click on that folder and then hit remove. We're going to remove it from Lightroom. Don't worry, we're going to add them back later, and this will not delete the images. It just tells Lightroom to forget where the images are on your computer. You can tell them where they are later. So to proceed, we are going to use software called LR Time-Lapse. LR Time-Lapse is the best time-lapse software available on the market. That's not to say it's particularly good, it still has its bugs. It's quite frustrating to use at times, but it is the best version of what we have available. I'm using LR Time-Lapse 4 here. There is a 5th version out as well, but version 4 works just fine for me, so it should be for you too. And it's worth mentioning that this is also free software. So there is a paid version, but they have a free trial, and the free trial allows you to do time lapses for sequences of up to 400 images. As we've already mentioned, a 300 image time lapse is going to be enough for 10 seconds, so we really don't need longer than 300 images, 300 frames. So you can continue to use this software for free so long as you use less than 400 frames. This is typically not advertised in a very clear manner on their website, but I know that the last time I went to download it, this was what was available, so you should be able to get this and use it for free. So once you've opened up LR Time-Lapse, go ahead and find that folder of the time-lapse images on your computer. So for me, I know it's going to be inside Pictures, and then I know it's going to be in Creative Course, which is grayed out here, and I'm going to go down to Time-Lapse. This is going to pull in all of the images, and it's going to add them in the date and time that they were shot. If it's not, you can click on the date time original up here, and it will sort it into a date and time order. As they start to load, you'll see that a blue line appears inside the image window. It shows you a preview, and you can start to preview what your time-lapse is going to look like. This blue bar is measuring the luminosity of each image. What that means is how bright an image is. It measures the exposure across each of the images. And what we want to try and have here is a smooth line for the best possible time-lapse. There are ways to fix this later, and we're also going to do some processing to these images. Wait for this to load, and then we'll proceed to the next step. Now that all of the luminosity previews are set, I'm going to use the basic workflow, and I'm going to use the Keyframes wizard. The Keyframe wizard has chosen just one keyframe. So what is a keyframe? Well, they're the important frames throughout the sequence that you need to take notice of. So for example, in this case, it's going to be the first frame. I'm going to edit my photos inside Lightroom, and I'm only going to edit the keyframes. Any other images in between these keyframes is going to be automatically edited with a transition, a very minute transition in between each photos. So let's say we had 300 images, and every 100 images there was a new keyframe. That would be a total of 4 keyframes. And let's say that I turned the exposure up by 1 stop of exposure on the first keyframe, and I left it at 0 on the second one. For that 100 photographs, LR Time-Lapse is going to turn the exposure down 1/100th of a stop in between each photograph, because it knows it needs to go down to 0 rather than +1 by the time it gets to 100 photographs. So it does it very smoothly, and it works out everything for you. It's why it's such useful software. You don't have to worry about editing every single photograph. Now, I shot this time-lapse on a cloudy day, and there's really not much changing in luminosity or brightness here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to edit, I think, the first, and I'm also going to add in the last keyframe too. And to do that, you go to the bottom and you press the keyframe icon, but you can go through and you can add a keyframe wherever you like. So let's say you see a spike here from this yellow bus, you might want to add a keyframe there, so you can edit that photograph. But what you would probably want to do, and the Keyframe wizard does a reasonable job, is every time there is a spike in the graph or it starts to dip down, you know that the luminosity is changing, and you will want to edit your photos accordingly. So every time there's movement in this graph, you'll want to go and add a keyframe and edit the photographs. So I've added 2 here, and what I'm going to do, and it's important here, you have to click Save.
And then there's a button here that says drag to Lightroom, and you literally drag this button over to Lightroom. And I'm going to click on import. It's going to import all of those photographs. And you'll notice it's imported it exactly where I left it before, inside the Creative Course folder. So while I'm on the Library tab, what I want to do is I need to go over to this drop down over here where it says Filters Off, and I want to go to 00 LRT for keyframes. And this is going to show me the two keyframes I selected, the first image and the last image. I'm going to go ahead and start editing this photo, just some really basic stuff. I'm going to use my standard initial adjustments photograph presets, and I've got the histogram warnings on up here so I can increase the highlights to make it a little bit brighter and bring the shadows down a little bit, make the darker parts a little bit darker. Maybe not too far, maybe the whites up a little bit further without clipping it, like so. It's not a particularly devastatingly interesting photograph, but it works well as a time-lapse. Traffic always works well. And I think that's going to be fine. You know, it doesn't take much, but it does add a little bit of detail. And I'm going to go to the next photograph, and I would edit this too. I'm just going to go and hit previous. So this will add the same editing from the last photograph and add it to that. And then what you're going to do is you're going to select all. So it's going to be Command A, and then right click and go to Metadata and save metadata to files. It's going to take this editing and it's going to apply it to the photograph. So now that I've hit continue, it saved it to the files. So when I go back into LR Time-Lapse now and I hit reload, it's going to see the editing. And you can see here that it's got a notice of everything that I've done to this first photograph, where I've changed the highlights and the shadows and the whites and the clarity, etc. The next step is to auto transition. This is what I was saying before, how it goes from one photograph keyframe to the next one, and it makes those minute adjustments. And then I'm going to add deflicker if needed. And what this is going to do is it's going to smooth out this luminosity graph. So you see, if I set it to 0, it follows the graph of this luminosity. But if I set it to 40, you can see it becomes a very smooth graph. So I'm going to leave it at 40, and then I'm going to hit save. Now before I hit save, I have to hit apply. It seems unnecessary, but that is how it works. And I'm going to hit save. And then once again, we go back to Lightroom. And this time I'm going to go back to filters off. I'm going to select all images, and I'm going to right click and go to metadata again. And this time I'm going to read the metadata from the files, because LR Time-Lapse has added that metadata to the files. Now I'm reading it so I can read it inside Lightroom. This will take just a moment. While we're waiting, I'm going to go back to Library, and I'm going to find this folder, which is Time-Lapse here, and this is going to allow me to export the images. Otherwise, what you'll find is you're on the most recent import folder and not the actual folder of images that you imported, and it won't allow you to export them. So I'm going to hit Time-Lapse here now, and now that that's done, I'm going to go to File, Export, and I'm going to go to LRT JPEG 4K at the top here. It's going to add it all to a folder, and I'm going to hit export. I don't change any of the export settings, and by hitting export here, it's going to allow me to create a time lapse. So now each of these 300 images are going to export to a folder on the desktop, and when that's done, a notification will come up and it will take me back to LR Time-Lapse where I can create the video. This can take a little while because it is obviously a lot of images to export. It might take 10 minutes or so. So we're going to pause the video here and jump right back in as soon as the images have exported. Now that the export process is complete, it's brought me back over to LR Time-Lapse, and you can see that the Lightroom icon is flashing. It says render task was submitted to LR Time-Lapse. I'm going to hit OK, and then I'm going to go back over to LR Time-Lapse.
And you'll find that it may not appear straight away. You might have to move your screen around, but it will pop up. And then you can choose the output size. So I can do 1080p, 3K, 4K. I'm going to do 4K, 29.97 frame rate. That's popular in Europe and most of the world. Quality I'm going to leave very high, and I'm going to leave everything else as it is. Then all I need to do is hit render video, and this is actually a fairly short process. It's the actual exporting of the images that takes a long time, but now that the images are exported, it should take just a minute or so before this time lapse is exported, and we finished with a complete time lapse. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and check out the links in the description below. This video was an excerpt from my course Wow Factor Photography, my creative photography course. If you like creative photography, then you'll love this course, so go ahead and check it out. And please, if you like this type of photography, consider subscribing. We're releasing new video content every Monday at 12 PM London time, so you can see more videos just like this if you hit subscribe below. Thanks very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.